Glad to have you all back at the Wharton Fintech Podcast, and I'm glad to be your host today. My name is Olamide Williams, and so new face, let me help you get familiar. I am a PhD student, not an MBA student at the Wharton School in the Legal Studies and Business Ethics Department. I'm studying ethics, politics, and public policy. This is going to make a little bit more sense when I get into my background. I am coming from DC, where I worked at the House Financial Services Committee for the first African American and first woman to chair the committee, Maxine Waters. And then I went to the Federal Reserve Board of Governors to work for the first woman chair of the board, Janet Yellen. After that, I went to Yale School of Management, where I studied systemic risk and financial crisis. After that, did few years stint in corporate finance, and then had been working in fintech policy at Block, formerly Square, ever since. And so I am delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you all about finance, fintech, and everything in between. But before we get into that, I'm going to introduce our special guest for Black History Month, Professor Chris Brummer out of Georgetown Law. It's really hard to know where to start when introducing Professor Brummer because he does such an incredible amount of work. But since this is a fintech podcast, it might make sense that some of you all know him from his Fintech Beat Podcast, which is a fintech policy podcast, and perhaps, my bias, one of the most famous ones in the DC area, if not the country. You also might know him from a lot of his other roles. He's on the board of Fannie Mae. He's on the board of K2 Integrity. He's on the board of Public.com, the social investing app. And he's also a scholar in residence at Paradigm, the $2 billion crypto fund. In today's episode, we will talk with Professor Brummer about his career trajectory and interests, where I find fascinating: hip hop, fintech, cryptocurrency, economic and financial inclusion, as well as regulatory as well as the regulatory and policy environment. This is going to give us a chance here at Wharton Fintech Podcast to do a Black History Month special with a Black History Maker. For some context, some of you might not know, this is a month-long Black History Month celebration in the States, and it was started by the great historian Carter G. Woodson and dates back to 1926. It highlighted some of the forgotten contributions of African Americans, and so we are going to want to tap into that for our Black History Month episode. Thanks again for joining us. Professor Brummer, thank you for being here. I am delighted to have you.
Hey, it's a pleasure to be here, especially on your maiden voyage as a podcast host.
Thank you very much. I don't know how I'm going to do, so you're going to have to really help me through because I know you're a vet. So as we get started, like for exemplars like you, I always have to know and I always have to ask how you got where you are. Like, your career is absolutely fascinating. You internationally and domestically, you're talking to everyone, heads of the IMF, World Bank, and then the finance ministers, Secretary of Treasury, State, X, Y, and Z, you name it. That's what you do. So I want you to provide a little bit of a career overview for people like me. Like, how did you get there so that if I want to get there too, I can have a little blueprint?
Yeah, well, it's interesting because, I think about how I spend my days nowadays and sort of talking to shadowy coders and then shadowy regulators and very, very public intellectuals on all these kinds of matters of financial technology. But really, when I think back, my sort of origin story starts in international diplomacy. I was always very interested in diplomacy and being a diplomat. And, for me, my entry into that, into sort of negotiations, I always thought about like cross-border sort of negotiations on financial and economic issues. Well, that was actually, my entry point was in the world of international financial regulation. And back in 2008, I was on loan to the SEC. I thought it was going to be a pretty peaceful, kind of easy sort of visit. I was at that point in time still at Vanderbilt, and then the bottom fell out of the markets, and that little tour there, and I was in the Office of International Affairs over at the SEC, really turned into what was this pivotal experience of seeing how international economic and financial regulatory diplomacy is conducted. And what I saw there was super interesting because what I saw when I was there was that people didn't use treaties and like formal legal obligations when they were trying to figure out how markets worked across borders. And you had all these institutions, they weren't the UN. They were things like, the Financial Stability Board, and they were all these kind of things.
Right.
And it was really, really interesting, that particular tool set. And then I noticed later, as I immediately shifted into sort of next generation issues, that tool set of non-binding best practices, sort of guesses, would be a tool set that everyone uses all across financial technology. And that's kind of how then my career took that shift into the fintech and the crypto space.
So you were at the SEC during the 2008 financial crisis. I didn't know that. That's actually fascinating. Look at that.
Yeah, it's like, that was one of those nooks and crannies in the I mean, literally, it was amazing, right? Because it went from, a very quiet kind of period where I thought I was going to be, as a professor. It was right before I was, going up for tenure and everything, kind of putting in some hardcore research, but instead, there are all these issues that were floating around, some with financial technology related issues. And it was all hands on deck, and it was a little bit like, hey, you over there, can you help us out? And I,
let me ask, how did you go from there to Georgetown Law? Because I know you as the Georgetown Law professor in DC.
Right. Well, so spending that time over at the SEC. So the SEC is only, I don't know, maybe a 10 or 15 minute walk from Georgetown's law school. So a lot of people think that Georgetown is physically located in Georgetown, but the law school is actually located right by Capitol Hill, right by the SEC. And I just thought, well, okay, I learned a lot, and I wanted to have an outpost to kind of learn a little bit more about finance and financial markets, and really like the let's call it the political science and the political economy behind the rules for finance, right?
Right.
And at that point in time, we're talking again, seminal year 2008. That's kind of important for a number of things, even for people who are interested in crypto. But at that point in time, the focus was banks, bank infrastructure, the electronics trading, and electronic infrastructure for derivatives, all these kinds of things, Dodd-Frank and like, right? And what happened as I saw how regulators were trying to figure out, how do you deal with these things? How do you regulate problems and infrastructures where the target of regulation is always evolving, right? Like how do you issue a rule, or how do you create a framework where you're trying to regulate a moving target, and where the tools for thinking about and for regulating things take a long time. To issue a rule, there's an entire process you have to go through. So how do you make sure that the administrative structures, the administrative state, can kind of keep track with innovation? Right.
And this is exactly why we have you on. I'm so glad for this, because I don't think at Wharton Fintech we actually get a lot of this framework. A lot of people don't get this framework. We just hear from the practitioners. So this is going to be fantastic. So not really shifting, but segueing, lately you focused on a lot of fintech and financial inclusion with board seats at different companies. So I want you to just talk us through that. You gave a great keynote last year at the SEC related to this. So how do you think about leaning in and, given your career arc?
So, financial technology is super interesting. Number one, because, getting back to the earlier sort of statement, it's always evolving, always changing. For someone who's a nerd like me, and probably like a lot of people listening, it rewards people who are willing to put their time into figuring out the details, right? And, over time, one of the things that I became very familiar with, and what I became to really appreciate, is that financial technology has a potential to really move the dial in some important ways. There's a reason why they call it innovation, and there are certain kinds of things you can do with it to really make people's lives better,
Mm-hmm.
and to do so in ways that haven't really been possible. So when you think about the
Mm.
digital economy, digital transformation, and the like, and I've reached, I'm an old man now, right? So I've reached a stage in life where I recognize that how a lot of people build better economic lives is through building some form of wealth, and
Absolutely.
for the average person, there are basically two ways to build wealth. There's generally, you own your house and you build equity, and then you participate in the economy. And the way in which we call that participation for the most part is called, owning financial assets, owning stock, right? You own shares in the economy, or in companies that are operating in the economy, and as they grow, then your own wealth grows. And if people can't sort of, think about the owning a house as that bottom rung, and then owning financial assets as the higher rungs, right? And so you climb the rungs of the ladder by accumulating financial assets. If people don't have the tools to do that safely, and to be even onboarded into the system where they can do that, you're going to have more of the problems that you hear about every day.
Right.
When you talk about the wealth gap, the income gap, racial and otherwise, you have to figure out a way as to how you can onboard people such that they have a stake in the economy. And I thought that financial technology was really an important way to do that. You mentioned the different board seats and all. Like I
Right.
think I went through all that to kind of give you an idea as to how I was mapping out and how I've mapped
Mm-hmm.
out a lot of my free time to the extent that I have it. And I'm on the board of Fannie Mae, and Fannie Mae
Yep.
is really backing the U.S. housing industry. $4 trillion balance sheet, and there I work on technology issues. It does amazing things like how can we use different kinds and sources of credit to open up the credit box for people. So instead of just using FICO, looking at things like rental data, so
Mm.
that people can begin to generate data where people can identify them as worthy credit risks.
Big.
Um,
That's big. Yeah.
big, 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 big for people of color, for everyone in the world. And so that was like sort of like one chunk of my mindset, right? And then there's K2
Right.
Integrity, premier consulting firm founded by Jeremy Kroll, his dad, Jules Kroll. I mean, this guy is the guy who quite literally invented the modern investigation company. And
Wow.
they're really big into regulatory issues, cybersecurity, crypto, ESG. So it's my opportunity to continue to learn from some of the best, right?
Right.
How do you climb that ladder? Financial assets, right? So I'm on the board of public.com. It's an
Mm.
amazing, like this app, right? And I'll try to just make it really simple. An app where there's the social layer where people can talk to one another about their own journey into investing while they can
Mm-hmm.
also sort of access investments. And why I like that is because when you look at the chronic underinvestment of women and people of color, Blacks and Latinos, a lot of times it's because people just feel a little bit frightened about investing. It's kind of foreign,
Right.
and so
Very
how
true.
to create a structure. Sometimes it's because people just frankly feel very disrespected. When they walk
Mm-hmm.
into the office of an investment advisor or something, they feel like they're being disrespected because that person may assume that they don't have any assets, or they may not be worth their time.
Right.
But can technology kind of speak to that? And then finally, getting to the sort of real frontier is some of the work over at Paradigm.
Right.
Really interesting kinds of issues, looking at crypto, thinking about the regulatory questions and the issues in the space.
I you are doing so much, an incredible amount, and such good work that I am just delighted that you have the time for Wharton Fintech. So big shout out to you for doing this for us during Black History
Oh
Month.
man,
That's amazing.
look, if Ola gives you a call, man, you're not going to miss, and
Right.
frankly, you're not going to miss the Wharton Fintech podcast. So it's really a
Right.
pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you. So I do want to drill down a little bit on how you feel and think about fintech overall, right? On one hand, what are and should regulators be looking at it? You did touch about it a bit with onboarding, but how is it also helping the economic and financial inclusion debate, if you think it is?
Well, I guess, just sort of to take a quick step back, how one should even think about the current status of the debate, or even just the conversation about financial technology. And I'll be honest, it's a little bit fraught, even here in our nation's capital. I know that must seem impossible to believe that our dialogue here can ever break down. But people tend to sort of migrate sometimes, to very very sort of extreme positions, right? Where you have some people who are intentionally oblivious to the risks of technology, and then you have people who are equally intentionally oblivious to its potential, right? And when you have that kind of sort of playing field for the marketplace of ideas, that can make getting good ideas to market, in the form of policy, a little bit challenging, right? Because you really have to, on the one hand, you want to meet people where they are, but you also want to be as rigorous and thoughtful as possible, and that's not always the case. I think that where you can often get consensus is frankly through sort of concrete use cases. And, and I say that because financial technology can be pretty complex. Not everybody is as nerdy as we are, and as all of our, maybe many of the listeners, to sit through and think about the details of financial instruments and technology and the like. So if you can sort of create or demonstrate very concrete use cases, you can get somewhere. And the example that I use is I have this, big conference every year called DC Fintech Week, and we get all of the
huge. We're not gonna just walk over that. We're not gonna gloss over that. DC Fintech Conference is the premier fintech conference in DC. All right, so
DCFintechWeek.org, but it's a free conference. I mean, it was always built off of this idea of, like, honestly, just making ideas and information free to the public about policy issues for financial technology, and it's probably the biggest of its kind, focused on policy in the world. And I always try to focus one day on financial inclusion, and for that sort of concrete use case, we looked at minority depository institutions and community banks, rural banks,
right? And
to sort of say, okay, small banks, minority banks, black and brown banks, they're having these problems in a digital economy. Now, a lot of the standard policy, sort of like the policy recipe for speaking to their challenges, is to recapitalize many of those smaller institutions that are really anchors to their local communities. But what we were, we had an entire work stream with, like, all the, big, we had, like, PayPal and Visa and we had, like, K2 was involved. I mean, we had all these very great
huge players, right?
I'm like huge players, and they were all thinking about, well, what does the technology, Plaid, like, what does the technology stack look like, and how can technology help those institutions scale, because they're still financial institutions. Because even if you recapitalize them, if some of them are still using paper-based processes, they're going to be right back asking for more assistance in 2 or 3 years. So part of the conversation has to be, how do you make them more competitive and able to serve their communities more effectively? And, and so we brainstormed a bunch of fintech solutions in a very, very concrete way. And that's to sort of demonstrate that, the technology can be, frankly, a critical piece to the success of very important financial institutions, especially in a world where, the economy has gone digital, right? So that's why you need to think about things like open banking, machine learning, big data, possibly blockchain-oriented solutions, so that those institutions can be more competitive, and so that they, like any other normal institution, can adapt, can thrive, and can scale. And that capital, though necessary, is only one part of the solution, right? It's not the whole thing.
this is why I had to have you on, and you had to be my first guest, because this concept, this idea is just incredibly important, and I don't think anyone, not many people hear this conversation going on in fintech, and so having it, especially during Black History Month, where we can amplify this show, is going to be, I think, crucial for our audience. So I kind of want to, we've talked about the customer and financial and economic inclusion there. I kind of want to switch to something that is near and dear to both of us, and that's the investor piece of this, and how that ties into culture. So, we aren't just consumers and of this fintech, of this technology, but we're also investors in it. Nas, investor in Coinbase. Jay-Z, Snoop Dogg, investors in Robinhood. And so I want to hear a few things. The first thing is, before we get into the nitty gritty, the nerdy, fintech stuff, I need to know your top 5 hip hop artists right now. We could. I'll save you for the right now and not do the all time.
First of all, this is, I can see that you were throwing, the easy questions first. How should we leverage open banking or something to say, community banks? Like, that's the easy stuff. So you're gonna ask me about the top 5 hip hop, top 5 hip hop artists of all time. All right. So first of all, so for all of you, millennials and Gen Zers, everything, look, I am still, the list changes with time. Who knows? Maybe one day Corday, maybe Griselda,
We get really
you don't know who's going to be on that list, one day, all right?
Right.
But right now, if you're going to talk about who's on Mount Olympus, I mean, you already mentioned some of the names, right? I mean, you got Nas, obviously, you got Jay-Z, who truly did understand that's a hard knock life. You got Black Star, which I will, yes, it's a group, but that's the way I can at least sneak into one, and then you have the Roots. So hey, Philly favorite, the Wharton crowd cannot dispute me on the Roots, but
they won't,
and they won't. So I think that would be, right now. I think those are the, let's call them the 5 entities, that sort of, for me, are the best of all time.
I love it. We're obviously we're gonna go back to this in a little bit, but I really did bring that up because we are investors in the fintech community, in the fintech space. And I want to know why you think there's such a strong connection with rap and fintech.
You know what it is? So that's a really interesting question, right? So the and you know what, on my podcast on Fintech Beat, we actually had an entire episode on trying to think through why is it that rappers like
I'm gonna have to rip up the script again. You can't. We're not gonna gloss over. We're not gonna gloss over your podcast, the Fintech Policy Podcast.
That's a funny idea because it's associated with the media company Roll Call, and they first said because it's a very hard news entity, and they approached me and they were like, oh yeah, just like journalists on the beat, we just want to be on that beat of fintech. Right. I was like, well, I want to be on the beat too, but it's gonna be on a different kind of beat. So
right.
Snuck in all this hip hop into the into the show. This is how you are subversive. And,
and so for our listeners, real quick, just talk about Fintech Beat Podcast a little bit. I mentioned it in my intro, but I mean, this is how I really got to know you before we started to connect a year ago. So please, just a little bit.
Yeah. What I thought about when starting the podcast was to have a conversation in ways that you don't normally hear. So on the one hand, if you can think of NPR for fintech, so I'm a professor. I like to kind of break things down into nuggets that everyday people can understand, even if it's pretty complex. So it's kind of like an NPR for fintech, and then on a hip hop and R&B tip, right? So it's we throw in kinds of concepts, people. Sometimes it's a very nerdy podcast, but also one that really has everybody on it. So we've had broadcasts with the head of China's efforts to launch a digital yuan, all the way down to Maxine Waters, all the way down to in this one episode to go through like why rappers like crypto, right? And to really talk about the policy choices, because going back to 2008, all that regulatory stuff that I did back in 2008, back then, it was all considered back office stuff that you do to prevent financial crises in the future. That same stuff is now front office stuff, right? It's something to define and to predict where the regulatory curve is going, what the shape of markets are going to look like, what they should look like. And I think that the public should have the opportunity to be very involved in those kinds of conversations.
Right.
So, getting to your question, I was like, well, why rap and fintech? I think that this was in this episode, and I think it was a really good observation, was what they have in common is a mistrust of the system, right? They sympathize with, the reality of that sometimes both markets and government can both, fail people. And so it's a kind of both are, have in their DNA a little bit of certainly pluck, and they have this interest in disrupting established systems. And I don't think that they have it just for the sake of doing it, but there is a certain kind of delight in it, right? And I think that both are married to this idea of climbing a ladder of success, right? Of understanding people who are on the margins. I mean, when you think about what financial technology, in theory, strives to do, right? By creating economies, network economies, by building companies on top of platforms, they create economies of scale, but those same kinds of economies of scale means that they can go deeper and broader to a wider set of people than other kinds of business models that aren't arranged that way. So because their incremental cost of onboarding someone is very, very low, they have the possibility of reaching a greater number of people. And then when you throw on top of that concepts, more recent ideas like decentralization, right? That kind of appeals, I think, to a lot of rappers, I mean, of course, fight the
power.
And when you get to this last little bit, when you get to fintech becoming crypto, becoming this conversation about what is money, right? I mean, that's ultimately what crypto comes down to. It's like literally, money at one point in time was like gold. Well, exactly. Nice. It's like hold up your book of money. It's like, is it gold? Is it silver? Is it a piece of paper and a banknote? Or is it code? Right. And when you get into that kind of a conversation, look, if there's one thing that rap understands is money. Right. And I think that there's a natural affinity to that conversation.
We could just stop right now. Like you're on a high, you're going higher, and we just need to stop at our highest point. But this is important, and it's so important for Black history because we're going to talk about crypto next, and you've already started that conversation. Disrupting, fighting the power, changing the narrative. It's in the DNA of rap and our culture just as much as it is in crypto. And so to see the two come together makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and this is something I try to explain, getting back to your earlier conversation in terms of, the conversation in Washington, D.C. And one of the conversations that I have with my friends all the time is that, just like anything in life, your perspective about something depends on your life experience and how you've encountered or, not just the product, but also the problem that the product or service is trying to solve. And so I tell people all the time, it's like, a lot of people, would say things, this is, it's really dating me. Like shortly after law school, Uber comes out. And, when you talk about Uber in the app, a lot of people would say, hey, it's destroying jobs. It's destroying, workers and rights and all. But, I'm in New York and I'm saying, well, that may be, but for the first time, I can get a cab to Harlem, right? Like for the first time now, instead of the medallion cabs that would never pick me up, right?
Speak on it.
for the first time, I can actually get to Harlem. I can literally
Right.
move through space and time now in a way that I couldn't do before. So
Right.
although I may be sympathetic to the criticisms or to the trade-offs involved in the app, if you're going to sort of present your moral disgust, I have to ask you, number one, where were you for the last, literally since the 60s when the medallion cabs, weren't picking up Black people and Latinos?
Right.
And then number two, if you have a better alternative, can you, talk about the mistrust of the system. How can I trust that you are going to understand that, Black and brown people are using this app for a reason? They're not dumb. It's not that they don't understand what they're doing.
Right.
They're using it for a reason. And
Right.
do you understand not just the app, but do you understand the motivations driving people in terms of their interaction with that technology? And I think that that's really important. I think it's hugely important on the fintech side because it's important in terms of, do you have minorities, with people with different experiences in VC to be able to fund those products, profitable products in ways that will service those communities that have been underserved? And then do you have the regulators in place who have the life experience and the common sense to understand what is happening in the real world and how their policy suggestions are going to impact them, right? Do you have, the experience, the diversity of experience so that you are actually going to be rigorous in your policy making?
So that's obviously where we want to go. And you beat me to it. The oversight and regulation that has been discussed for months now, several months now, on the Hill, in the White House, just all over DC, is how to regulate crypto because of consumer investor protection. But at the same time, there needs to be a balance with innovation and the opportunity it provides our communities. So I want to ask you, how do you do it? How do you strike that balance? Like, what would you say to the regulators that are trying to regulate crypto and the fintech space, and how to balance that innovation for, inclusivity to a group that just hasn't been able to find that in the system?
So huge questions. Number, and has lots of different parts, because when you get into something like crypto, it touches on lots of very disparate parts of the regulatory ecosystem. So one of the big ironies is that, the only thing that may be as decentralized at times as the blockchain or blockchains or public blockchains is our government, especially when it comes to the financial regulatory agencies. There are lots of them, and they have different sort of fingers in different parts of the system. I think number one, information is key. Policymakers have to understand what they're regulating, just like anybody else. Just like market participants. There's a certain amount of work that has to be done to just get a grasp of the basic concepts, before you start to write policies. And then once you do that, I think that some of the principles of sound regulation says, well, especially if it's always moving, you have to develop a framework in which your regulation doesn't become outdated within 6 months of you issuing the rule. You can't invest 2 to 3 years into a regulatory work stream just such that 6 months after it's finally debated and there's drama and, hurt feelings by different regulators and policymakers. And then in 6 months after it's been issued, people have worked around it, or it's just obsolete because the technology has moved on. And I think part of that is, involves thinking through seriously how and in what way you engage market participants, because ultimately they're on the front lines and they're always going to be a little bit faster. Now, I've written in some of my scholarship, about piloting projects and how government itself can experiment. This gets back to the original remarks, the soft law, informal standards, best practices. What are the kinds of things that governments can do to experiment with new technologies, including crypto? And, I think that what I'm working on now is how can you develop compliant solutions in a way, I'm gonna have that may be native to the infrastructure that you're talking about. And I think that's kind of important. I think that's important because, so I'm working on this big, like, as you know, it's literally coming out now is this big project on DeFi and dApps, decentralized applications, and disclosure. And there, when you think about tools, there's this developer ecosystem with people who are really smart and energetic and always innovating. How can you bring that energy and harness that energy in a way so that you can challenge them to not only work within the regulatory system, but to frankly build on it, and in some instances even improve it, right? And I think that's going to have to be an essential element of how you look at some of these infrastructures, especially since there is a disintermediation of gatekeepers, right? Like a lot of the DeFi stuff is the major nodal points that financial regulators have depended on in order to sort of exert their authority aren't necessarily in the picture. So if that's the case, you have to think a little bit broader, and you think about, the software engineers and the coders and the others, the founders, to try to think through, well, we have our standards and we have expectations. We should always keep our expectations, but how can we also harness that innovative energy in ways to help us further our mandate and to make sure that the regulatory infrastructure evolves alongside with,
100%.
The technology.
100%. So going there, I'm going to continue this line of questioning. And this is probably the real tough one, right? How are crypto and DeFi actually making it less expensive to be poor, right? How is it helping expand access to credit?
So, one of the issues that I'm trying to explore is just that. So there is like the traditional kind of story, and I'll use one from my own life. So during right in between the New Year's and Christmas, I had to actually like wire some money. And I live in DC, but I'm walking distance from Silver Spring. So
there we go.
Yeah, predominantly Latino, Black area. Lots of immigrants and right. And I went to a bank. I won't say the name of the bank, but I went to the bank, and literally, I go in, and there was no one in the bank to help me to wire the money, and they effectively said, go to the white neighborhood.
Right.
To go and wire it. So I hop in my car and I head out 20 minutes to Maryland. All right.
Yeah.
And I go there, and then I wire my money, and then I'm charged $40. Right. And then I'm looking, and I'm saying to myself, look, all right. And this is, again, this is the kind of life experience, right? This is the kind of life experience that when I, it's Uber all over again, right?
Yeah.
Where then people will go and they'll say, well, Chris, this is, and I'm like, look, man. I can't even move money, and and I'm a fortunate person. I'm a Georgetown Law professor. I mean, I live in a Black area, predominantly Black area, but like there are a lot of people who can't afford that, right? And that's just the crypto conversation. But you can get into all kinds of things. I'm giving the keynote speech to FinCEN, the financial crime fighters, right? And part of that conversation is like, how do you use the same technology that's used to identify people as bad? Can you repurpose or double purpose that same technology to identify people as good? So in other words, whitelist them so that it's cheaper for them to access services, right? But like these kinds of questions have to be asked, and they're not always asked, and there aren't always incentives for people to ask them.
That's why we have you.
Well, it's like just like in the private sector, there aren't always those incentives in the public sector either, right? Right, and so, the crypto conversation right now, and it's still very early days, and frankly, there haven't been until now, and now you're seeing, frankly, lots of people of color entering into the crypto space, really bearing down on that question. But, the T1 conversation was on remittances, which is huge, right? Moving money internationally, the high cost, and now it's starting to get into the questions of financial services. Like, are there ways to conduct financial services that are much cheaper and or faster that can still be safe? And that question is still out frankly, there hasn't been very much attention focused and directed to it, but there will be. And one of the things that I think most people sort of forget is that, when there is intentionality directed towards these kinds of issues, you can get some really interesting answers. So a lot of the attention, and there's been a lot of sort of data published about how, in terms of owners of Bitcoin, Blacks and Latinos are much more likely to own more cryptocurrency than their white counterparts. That conversation is actually quite distinct from the use cases part. Although even that kind of investment question is a fascinating and important question. And I think, sometimes I read these op-eds and frankly, by people who are, who frankly assume that that a lot of us have absolutely no idea as to what they're trying to do. And it's a kind of a paternalism that I think if people are not self-aware, it actually ends up exacerbating the racial wealth and income gap.
100%.
Because a lot of people are they're not dumb. A lot of people are trying to own different kinds of, and I'll just stick with crypto since we're in the crypto conversation. There are a lot of middle-class moms in Atlanta, in Detroit, in New York, who said to themselves, you know what? Those guys over in Silicon Valley out in the West Coast were able to create empires off of new technology. I don't want my child to be unprepared for that. So, hey, you know what? Just for kicks and giggles, I'll get involved in this because I want my children to understand new technologies. Who knows if it'll do well or not? But I want them to have that exposure. I mean, these are kind of conversations that, frankly, a lot of people have no idea go on in lots of Black families, and they assume from a behavior because too often we talk at people and not with people. They're assuming from the behavior that it's just all rampant speculation, and people aren't considering or aren't thinking through their decisions. And then sometimes people really are trying to make money. Then you need to ask yourself, well, why is it that they find that particular asset or crypto assets or Bitcoin or whatever it is, why, or real estate or house flipping or whatever it is, why are people doing that? Well, maybe it's not necessarily irrational, depending on, people say, well, Bitcoin lost 50%. Yeah, well, if you invested in Bitcoin 5 years ago, you're doing pretty well. So, it depends. But maybe people are doing it because they think that, again, the mistrust of the system, that the traditional routes through which people have been able to invest haven't necessarily been trustworthy, right? And maybe they think that, okay, I would try to invest in the stock market, but other people, that can always be either gamed, or my ability to access information about that market is always compromised, or I have to walk into the office, getting back to my days over at Public, or I have to walk into the office of someone who's just looking down at me, and I don't feel like that. I don't feel like being disrespected. I mean, there are all kinds of different kinds of reasons, but if regulators and frankly the crypto industry don't take the time to kind of understand their stakeholders, all of them, right? Then, as I've written before, financial technology will be doomed to repeat mistakes, and the very mistakes that matter the most for other people, and that we really have to avoid that.
Very well said. Absolutely. And that's I can't ask for more in an answer on Black History Month than the one you just gave. I know I'm taking up a lot of your time, and I'm watching the clock, and I'm like, but I have to ask you.
Yeah, but Black History Month, as I was, and I'm, as I tell my friends over at for my FinCEN talk, Black history is the art of making the unseen seen, right? And I think that a lot of people, even in the financial technology space and innovators, should be able to identify with that.
Right. And making the unseen seen. That's big. That's a bar.
That's a bar. It's the art of making. It's the art of making the unseen seen. Wow. And when you can start to think more deeply and to practice and to move those muscles in your head, you start to understand the world differently. You start to understand that everybody has something to contribute. and you in turn become better and you become smarter. And so Black History Month is important. It's important not just to Black people, but it's important to everybody.
Right. And so the way I'm going to end this then is that we're going to go back to the barbershop talk. All right. So you just gave us an incredible bar of your own, which you got to make sure that.
Two turntables and a microphone, somewhere buried in my basement.
Do you? Oh, we didn't even get to. Oh,
break out my little cardboard box and have my little very, very pathetic midlife, breakdancing that will probably break. The thought breakdancing is literally breaking my bones as opposed to.
So now I got to ask you, for our listeners, what are your top 5 songs, and it could be more than 5, about money? I have a few that I kind of took from you, but I want to hear yours.
Okay, I'm really, really more curious to hear because, all right. So, Jay, Hard Knock Life. Biggie, Juicy. It was all a dream.
That. I play that, I think, once a week. My kids are going to get that. They're going to have to get that.
I would Nas, You Can Hate Me Now. I like that.
Okay.
One. But I decide that's my left field one, right? But I think the two that are head and shoulders the best for rap songs about money. I'll be curious if you can beat these two. Locks, Money, Power, Respect, and then second, and then Wu-Tang.
I know.
Cream.
You got to. There's no way. I don't think you get better than Cream. But on your podcast,
Locks, Money, Power, Respect. That is.
Yeah. That's big. That's big.
Because there's a philosophy, there's a lifestyle and a philosophy behind that one. So I
think you need to name a class. I think you need to name a class after that.
Respect. I like that. Maybe I'll try that.
For me, I obviously got to go to the Fintech Beat Podcast, right? All About the Benjamins. That gets me going every time I hear it. More money, more problems.
Okay. That's good. Good.
Junior Mafia, Get Money. And if we're gonna keep it with the Jay-Z theme, Money Ain't a Thing. I think that was him and Jermaine Dupri.
Yeah. But yeah. It's good. It's like strong. The boss is with this one. It's good. That's a good list. That's a good list.
Yeah.
Although, when you just look, as I said, you start listening to Money, Power, Respect, man. There's, as I said, it's not just the lyricism. It's not just the bars.
Right.
But they are, they are postmodern philosophers. What can I say?
That's gonna be the theme then for this show. Money, Power, Respect, Black History Month.
Money, Power, Respect. Oh, I like it.
Yeah. It's all you. So look, I cannot thank you enough for doing this. I've taken so much of your time. Wharton Fintech is gonna love this. I'm sure our listeners are gonna love this. Hey,
it was my pleasure. Shout out to the Wharton Fintech Podcast universe.
Certainly.
And I thank you so much. I'm extremely proud of you and all that you're doing.
Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to hearing some more podcasts to come.
Thank you. Have a good one.
All right.
Thank you for joining the Wharton Fintech Podcast for our Black History Month episode with Professor Chris Brummer. I absolutely enjoyed it, and I really do hope you did too. His presentation is certainly powerful. I know we had and mentioned a lot, so I've linked Professor Brummer's details in case you want to keep up with the good professor. Wharton Fintech has also partnered with Tidal to produce a Black History Month playlist having to do with the mentions about money and fintech and crypto in this podcast. So please check that out. Major shout out to our partners at Tidal for bringing our music to life as they usually do over there. I hope to do more Wharton Fintech episodes in the future. But until next time, everyone, cheers.